In modern society, religion and belief ought to provide individuals with spiritual support, moral guidance, and inner stability. Yet the existence of cults often runs directly counter to these values. Rather than fostering personal growth, cults frequently rely on extreme doctrines, coercive practices, and control through fear, causing serious harm to individuals, families, and even society as a whole. However, within a social framework that places great emphasis on freedom of belief and pluralism, we often hesitate and feel uncertain about whether cults can or should be banned, and how this might be done. If they are left unchecked, cults may continue to expand. If intervention is excessive, legitimate religions and individual freedoms may be infringed. The core issue, therefore, is not simply whether cults should be prohibited, but how to identify and prevent their harm effectively while still safeguarding freedom of belief. This discussion will proceed step by step, examining the harm caused by cults, the difficulty of defining them, the reasons the problem has worsened, and how more objective and workable principles and systems for banning cults might be established. Hi everyone, I'm Eric, a cat who dreams of becoming a philosopher. This is the place where I share my thoughts and explore new ideas with you all. So let's dive into today's topic. The harm caused by cults rarely erupts suddenly. Instead, it accumulates gradually through long-term and systematic processes, making their destructive power harder to detect. At the individual level, cults typically rely on psychological manipulation as their primary tool. By generating fear, guilt, or the illusion of salvation, they gradually erode followers' capacity for independent thought, encouraging them to surrender their judgment entirely to the group or its leader. In such circumstances, followers no longer assess right and wrong through reason, but solely through compliance with doctrine, leading to a severe erosion of personal dignity and autonomy. At the level, cults often demand that followers sever ties with non-believers, portraying family bonds as obstacles to faith. This frequently results in broken relationships, long-term conflicts, and lasting psychological trauma. Economically, cults commonly exploit followers financially under the guise of donations, tests of faith, or promises of redemption, pushing many into debt and even depriving them of basic means of living. At the societal level, cults tend to cultivate extreme worldviews that reduce the outside world to a rigid division between friends and enemies, thereby justifying exclusion and hostility towards dissenters. When such thinking spreads, it undermines social trust and can escalate into violence or threats to public safety. The harm caused by cults is therefore not merely a matter of individual choice, but a tangible threat to the social order as a whole. In general discussion, cults are often defined as belief organizations that deviate from mainstream religions or social values and exhibit extreme or harmful characteristics. Yet, such definitions are frequently vague and subjective. Understanding what constitutes the mainstream or a deviation vary across cultures and historical periods, making clear boundaries difficult to draw. Some religions were once regarded as heretical in their early stages, only later to become widely accepted belief systems. This historical experience has made people particularly cautious about judging cults based solely on doctrinal content or the novelty of ideas. Moreover, common definitions often list characteristics such as the worship of a charismatic leader, strong exclusivity, or tight control over followers' lives. However, these traits are not simply present or absent. They exist by degree. Even established religions may display similar features in certain contexts, making it difficult to judge purely on surface appearances. As a result, the definition of cults has long remained at the level of moral condemnation or loose social consensus, lacking operational criteria. This leaves law enforcement and policymakers uncertain and hesitant, unsure how to act. The reason cult-related problems have become increasingly severe in contemporary society lies, first and foremost, and the long-standing absence of effective and forward-looking means to prevent cults from emerging in the first place. Existing systems tend to intervene only after clear harm has occurred, such as acts of violence, mass casualties, or large-scale fraud. Yet the most destructive phase of cult activity often takes place much earlier, through ideological control, psychological manipulation, and the gradual erosion of personal choice. These practices are extremely difficult to identify promptly within legal and institutional frameworks, leaving preventive mechanisms largely ineffective. At the same time, because of the high value placed on freedom of belief, governments and societies tend to adopt an extremely restrained or even evasive approach to religious issues. Freedom of belief was originally intended to protect individuals from coercion. But in the absence of clear boundaries, this principle is instead exploited by cults to justify their behavior. As long as a cult presents itself as a religion, criticism can easily be framed as persecution of faith, weakening the legitimacy of public intervention. In addition, the widespread sense of isolation, insecurity, and loss of values in modern society provides fertile ground for cults to grow. When individuals fail to find a stable sense of belonging in family life, work, or public institutions, the simplified answers and intense sense of identity offered by cults can become highly appealing. Without effective prevention and regulation, the cult problem inevitably continues to spread and deepen. Furthermore, public awareness of the dangers posed by cults often focuses only on extreme cases, overlooking the long-term impact of their everyday operations. When no immediate crisis occurs, cults can persist under the guise of ordinary religious or spiritual groups, causing public debate and institutional responses to lag behind reality and further entrenching the problem structurally. The greatest obstacle to banning cults lies in the persistent lack of objective, clear, and workable standards for distinguishing cults from ordinary religions. If judgments are based solely on doctrine, theology, or moral evaluation, they inevitably become mired in subjectivity. Different groups hold vastly different views on what constitutes legitimate belief or dangerous ideology, making any determination vulnerable to accusations of value impositions or political interference. As a result, it becomes impossible to determine clearly which organizations should be banned and which should continue to enjoy protection under freedom of belief. This blurred boundary leaves policymakers and law enforcement in a prolonged state of hesitation and observation, amounting in practice to tolerance, allowing cults to operate and expand in gray areas. The difficulty is compounded by the fact that cults often coexist with or attach themselves to mainstream religions. They may cloak themselves in orthodox religious names, histories, or symbols, making their actual conduct and syntax difficult to discern. Any attempt to ban cults can then be portrayed as targeting an entire religion, provoking fears of infringements on religious freedom. This risk makes banning cults an especially sensitive and challenging task. The absence of objective criteria also leads public debate to become emotional and polarized. One side fears the threat cults pose to social security, while the other worries about governmental overreach and the erosion of religious freedom. When debate remains stuck at the level of value conflict rather than concrete behavior, policy proposals struggle to gain consensus. This prolonged inability to reach agreement allows cults to persist within institutional gaps, sometimes being mistaken for merely alternative beliefs rather than serious social problems. Ultimately, banning cults lacks both legal tools and public support, rendering it difficult to implement as public policy. At first glance, the distinction between cults and ordinary religions may seem to rest solely on subjective value judgments. In reality, however, there exists a relatively clear and workable boundary. The key does not lie in whether beliefs are reasonable, but in how doctrines are enforced. Cults typically require people to comply unconditionally, whereas ordinary religions generally remain at the level of moral exhortation. The crucial difference between must and ought to lies in who initiates punishment when doctrine is violated. If an individual, based on personal belief, voluntarily accepts some form of penalty after breaching a doctrine, this is a matter of personal choice and part of freedom of belief. If, however, punishment is imposed by a third party and enforced against the individual's will, this ceases to be religious practice and becomes an exercise of power and coercion. It is important to note that those subjected to enforced punishment are not necessarily believers. They may simply be individuals deemed to have violated doctrine. Voluntary acceptance of punishment belongs to faith itself, whereas being forced to accept punishment means being compelled to bear another person's faith. To genuinely protect freedom of belief, society must prohibit all forms of enforced doctrine. By this standard, cults can be objectively defined as organizations that deny others freedom of choice and enforce doctrine through third-party power. The advantage of this approach is that it avoids making valued judgments about belief content and instead focuses on whether coercion is involved. No matter how abstract or supernatural a doctrine may be, as long as its practice is based on voluntary participation, society has no legitimate reason to intervene. Once enforcement involves control, threats, or punishment imposed on others by third parties, however sacred its justification may appear, it falls outside the realm of freedom of belief. Such a definition prevents accusations of ideological interference or censorship, because what is prohibited is not what people believe, but what they do to others. By focusing on whether punishment is imposed on a non-consensual basis, a clear and verifiable boundary emerges between cults and ordinary religions, allowing bans to rest on concrete conduct rather than subjective accusation. Once an objective definition of cults has been established, the next crucial step is to address their coexistence with mainstream religions. In reality, many religions contain only a small number of individuals who enforce doctrine in coercive ways, making it difficult to decide whether the entire religion should be classified as a cult. In such cases, society must adopt clear and consistent principles. If a religion has not actively repudiated, condemned, or prevented these coercive practices, it should be classified as a cult in its entirety. This approach does not target belief content, but holds religious organizations accountable for their actual conduct. If a religion genuinely respects freedom of belief, it must clearly identify unacceptable behavior and actively distance itself from it. Silence or tolerance amounts to tacit approval of coercive faith. Through such institutional arrangements, society can not only ban cults effectively, but also address extremism within religious communities. The emphasis here is on placing responsibilities squarely on religious organizations rather than individual believers. The aim of banning cults is not to police personal belief, but to require organizations to bear the consequences of coercive behavior they allow or tolerate. When organizations understand that failure to repudiate such behavior will result in being classified as cults, they will be compelled to establish internal restraints to avoid crossing prohibited thresholds. This design also helps prevent selective enforcement. Governments need not judge which doctrines are right or wrong, but only whether coercive enforcement by third parties exists and whether the organization has clearly opposed and stopped it. This increases transparency and strengthens public trust in anti-cult policies. More importantly, by requiring religions to actively separate themselves from cult-like practices, society can draw a clear line between moderate believers and extremist actions, reducing the risks of wider radicalization. In this way, banning cults becomes not merely a punitive measure, but a long-term strategy for preventing the spread of extremism. Many people assume that orthodox religions will naturally oppose cults that attach themselves to them, but this view overlooks real-world incentive structures. In fact, cults affiliated with mainstream religions often bring objective benefits to those religions. One key interest of Orthodox religions lies in expanding their follower base and social influence. and cults exploit the reputation of mainstream religions to grow, while simultaneously increasing their visibility. Under such conditions, orthodox religions may lack strong incentives to distance themselves from cults, and may even choose to tolerate or protect them. Without external pressure, expecting religions to resolve internal problems voluntarily is unrealistic. Legal and institutional measures are therefore necessary to ensure that the cost of protecting cults outweighs the benefits. Only when distancing themselves from cults becomes the rational and necessary choice will religious organizations genuinely draw clear boundaries, allowing anti-cult policies to be effectively implemented. Relying solely on moral criticism or social expectation provides little incentive for orthodox religions to bear the internal costs of cutting ties with cults. Such actions may lead to loss of followers, reputational damage, or internal power struggles, risks that rarely justify action in the absence of external pressure. Simply calling for religious self-discipline is therefore unlikely to succeed in practice. By institutionalizing responsibility through law, existing incentive structures can be altered. When religious organizations understand that tolerating or protecting cult behavior will bring tangible legal consequences, their rational choice shifts from tolerance to separation. The purpose of this incentive design is not to punish religion itself, but to encourage it to uphold clear boundaries between faith and coercion, thereby making anti-cult policies more effective. Some may worry that official intervention in religious affairs could trigger violent factional conflict within religions. Yet it is worth asking whether a religion in which such conflicts are possible truly deserves unconditional protection. In factional struggles, at least one side, and often all sides, display tendencies towards extremism, and extremism itself negates freedom of belief. By officially defining and banning cults, clear exit routes can be provided for the majority of innocent believers, preventing them from being drawn into extreme behavior. At the same time, this can force religions to reflect on their doctrines and practices, reducing the likelihood of further radicalization. When religions are compelled to distance themselves from cults, cults lose the space to grow. Although some superficial stability may be sacrificed in the short term, this institutional arrangement offers far greater safety and stability in the long run. Superficial stability built on ignoring potential violence and coercion is, in reality, a fragile and temporary balance. Cults and extremism often grow gradually in the absence of oversight, and when conflict finally erupts, the damage far exceeds the disruption caused by early intervention. Accepting a degree of social adjustment cost at an early stage therefore helps prevent more severe security crises later. Moreover, clearly defining and banning cults also creates space for non-extremist believers to exit or transform. When the state clearly identifies unacceptable behavior, believers are no longer forced to choose between silence and obedience, but can reconsider whether their faith has been distorted. In the long term, what appears to be a sacrifice of local stability is in fact the construction of a more solid and sustainable foundation for social security as a whole. Banning cults is not a rejection of belief, but a means of genuinely safeguarding freedom of belief and social safety. Through objective definitions, institutional incentives, and clear responsibility, it becomes possible to respect diversity while preventing coercion and harm. Only in this way can religion return to its true purpose, and society achieve a more stable balance between freedom and security. That's all for this video. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. Every like, subscribe, and comment are a contribution to solving those difficult questions. I look forward to your joining our discussion and making a contribution to solving the difficult questions. Once again, thank you for your watching. Goodbye!